Muito bem. Eu vou-vos dar um último boa tarde da minha parte. Nós vamos ter uma apresentação, mais uma apresentação antes do debate com os representantes institucionais. Vamos ter uma apresentação sobre o sistema inglês, dada pelo professor Peter Scott, que penso que está connosco online, ou vai estar connosco online. E como já ouvimos falar, é uma apresentação sobre um sistema que é um sistema mais unificado e, portanto, é este terceiro exemplo que vamos abordar hoje. Eu apresentava, I will start to present Professor Peter Scott and I will tell Professor Peter Scott that we have around 45 minutes presentation, and then we also have space for questions, 10 to 15 minutes questions, so the audience can put questions, and so we'll maybe do that. And Professor Peter Scott is Professor Emeritus of Higher Education Studies at the Institute of Education at the Faculty of Education and Society at UCL. Is also Fair Access Commissioner for Scotland. He was a Vice Chancellor of Kingston University and member of the board of the Council for the Financing of Higher Education in England. He was President of the Association for Academic Cooperation, editor of the Times Higher Education for 15 years, and he published his most recent book is Retreat or Resolution, Tackling the Crisis of Mass Higher Education. And so I welcome Professor Peter Scott to this event, and I will give you, the floor is yours now, please.
Thank you very much. I apologize, I can't be with you in person. I would love to be in Porto. The reason I'm afraid is that my wife has been ill and I need to care for her, and it makes it difficult for me to travel at the moment. So I apologize for having to present online, although I think we all got very used to it during the COVID pandemic. I'm going to talk about the unification of the UK higher education system, which took place in 1992, and the consequences of that. But I need to express a caveat right at the start. We talk about UK, the United Kingdom, but in practice, of course, we have separate higher education systems in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland to a limited degree. And there are major differences. The most obvious, although not relevant to our discussion today, is that in England, students pay high fees, the highest fees of any public system of higher education in the world. And in Scotland, they have free higher education, as is the European norm. So I will often need to modify whether I'm talking about the UK or England, and in practice, I'll be mainly talking about England. It's an interesting case study, I think, nevertheless, but I think I need to repeat the warning, which UC also repeated, that every higher education system is to some degree unique. It's unique in terms of the legal and administrative structures and background, and even more obviously, I think, in terms of history and culture. A number of years ago, I went to Sweden at the invitation of the chair of a commission they had at that time to write a report, a view from outside. And what struck me was that some of the most obvious things about Swedish higher education weren't mentioned to me initially because they, in a sense, were so obvious to the Swedes. They were just inbred in the history of their system. But of course, if you come from outside, it needs to be explained to you. So it's important, I think, how important comparative studies are in higher education. We always need to remember there are very important differences, and there are great risks in making simplistic comparisons between countries. I want to do two things. Before I get on to the UK as a case study, or perhaps England as a case study, I want to talk more generally about the typology of higher education systems, to set the scene in a way, and also to talk about diversity and what we mean by diversity, and what is the difference between diversity and stratification and differentiation. And then I want to talk a bit about the kind of what I call the holy grail of tech. All countries, and I'll talk about this in a moment, see their salvation in advanced technologies. And then I'm going to talk about, secondly, the main subject I want to address, the UK as a case study. And here I'll talk about the origins and development of the binary system that existed between 1966 and 1992. And then I'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the unified system we've had for the last 30 years. And then I'll perhaps draw some conclusions at the end, although I suspect they'll be rather tentative ones. So first, let me set the scene. The typology of higher education systems. The conventional division is between binary or dual systems, such as exist in France, Germany, Finland, as we've been told, Ireland, the Netherlands, and of course until 1992, also in England and Scotland. Then unified systems, the pacemaker, I suppose, in Europe was Sweden in the 1960s. But it's important to recognize that distinctions remain even within apparent unified systems. The legal status of all institutions may be similar, but the important differences remain in terms of size, status, and mission. And England has had a unified system since 1992, and I'll talk about that again. And then we have stratified systems, formally stratified. Most US states have that, and the archetype, I suppose, is California, the California Master Plan, first developed in the 1960s, but still actually going strong, although having been adapted on many occasions since. And to take the California example as the archetype, the distinction is between the University of California with its campuses, Berkeley, UCLA, San Diego, etc., which are selective in their intake. You have to graduate in the top 12.5% of your high school class to be eligible to enter, and also have a monopoly of doctoral degrees, and are also, certainly in the case of Berkeley and UCLA, extremely research-intensive universities. Then a second tier, if you like, the State University of California, the many campuses of the State University of California, which are four-year colleges, offering undergraduate degrees and also master's degrees. And then finally, the community colleges, open access institutions, which offer associate degrees, which can be transferred into credit in the California State University, or even occasionally the University of California itself, but also offer a very wide range of vocational programs. Now, I think it's important to emphasize that this is a rather formal typology. These are ideal types. None of them really exists. For example, binary and dual systems. It's usually the non-university sector which is less prestigious, but not always the case. In France, the Grande École, of course, in a way are more selective than the universities in their entry, and some of them, to some degree, have a greater prestige. And also, I think it's important to mention on binary and dual systems, there are other kinds of binary and dual systems which exist in Europe. One of the most important, I suppose, is the association between universities, education, and research, often delivered in specialist institutions, Max Planck institutes in Germany, CRS in France, and in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe, still academies of science with quite separate research institutes. In England, the Anglo-Saxon model, if you like, there's a much tighter integration between universities and research establishments. Most research establishments are located within universities, but that's not the subject of what we're talking about. The point I just want to make is that there are no ideal types. There are no pure forms. The greater detail you go into, the more differences emerge. The second thing I want to talk about in terms of setting the scene is the tension, the dynamic between diversity and hierarchy. After all, diversity, differentiation, the need for greater pluralism in university missions is a constant theme. I think many governments take this up as a major theme. Let's discuss, though, I think, is at what level should this diversity and differentiation take place? Should it be between types of institution, universities and polytechnics, as they were in England and as still is the case in Finland? Individual institutions ranked in some kind of hierarchy? Or should it be, and I think this is more interesting, within institutions themselves, because of course institutions have become much larger, much more diverse and heterogeneous in their missions, and they contain within them very high levels of pluralism compared even to 2 decades ago. And then there's the argument about the tension between differentiation of missions, all of which are seen as having equal esteem, inferior at any rate, and effectively a status hierarchy. And how is that status hierarchy defined? Often in terms of selectivity of admissions, where universities have that right to select their own students, particularly, of course, in research intensity and research excellence, and that's reinforced by league tables and global rankings, but also perhaps, and this is what the UK government in the case of England had hoped in 2010 in terms of differential fees, that the most prestigious universities would charge higher fees than those that had less to offer their students. In practice, that didn't happen, and I'm very happy to answer questions about why that didn't happen. The university sector, as I said earlier, is normally the most prestigious, but not always. Grande École in France are particularly prestigious institutions. And a final point, there's the magnetic attraction of the US research university, and that's, of course, reinforced by global rankings. The closer, in a sense, you are to Harvard and Berkeley, the better you will do in research rankings. So the idea of a research-intensive university, multi-faculty, is really an alluring one, and I think it's had quite a distorting effect, not only within the United States itself, of course, but across other higher education systems. And finally, just briefly, what I call the holy grail of tech. National growth, innovation, research strategies, they focus very strongly and perhaps too narrowly on developing advanced technologies and exploiting advanced technologies. And you see this in relationship, of course, to the ubiquity of tech titles somewhere. You see it at the elite level, ETH in Zurich, the École Polytechnique, although it now has a slightly different name, it's been reformulated, technical universities in Germany, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, all these are elite institutions with a technology or tech somewhere in the title. But also it was extensively used for the alternative type of institution, the polytechnics in England, and now in Ireland, the technological universities, and previously the institutes of technology. So that's by way of setting the scene. Let me now move on to the UK example, the UK as the test case. And as I say, I'm predominantly talking about England, although occasionally I will mention Scotland a bit because of my role there, and even Wales. First, I think it's useful to think in terms of 3 major stages of development of the UK higher education. Until the 1960s, there wasn't really a system of higher education. People wouldn't have recognized there being a system. And it was the Robbins report in 1963 that first used that language, there being a system of higher education. Instead, there was a loose and uncoordinated collection of universities, perhaps aggregation is better than collection, universities, traditional universities, which were funded directly by the Treasury, the Ministry of Finance, through a buffer body, the University Grants Committee, and then local authority and voluntary colleges being church-related colleges, which were funded through the Ministry of Education. So there wasn't even a single ministry actually overseeing a system of higher education until 1964 in the UK. Then between 1966 and 1992, we had a binary system, the major difference being between universities and polytechnics. But as I will explain in a moment, these two apparently different sectors with different missions actually were on a highly convergent course during the 1970s and 1980s, to such a degree that when we came to the 1990s, some form of unification, I think, was seen as inevitable. So now we have a unified system. Some have called it a market system, certainly in England, not in Scotland or Wales to the same degree. And it's certainly a highly marketized system in terms of its behavior and many of its practices. And within that, you have a dominant university sector, more than 170 universities in the UK, and they enroll 80% of students in higher education. But that dominant university sector is differentiated in terms of status and perhaps mission as well, and even size. And then we have a minority sector of other providers of higher education. And there are two main groups here: further education colleges, technical colleges if you like, which provide predominantly technical education at a perhaps lower level, technician level, but also deliver quite substantial amounts of higher education, particularly in a highly professional and vocational mode. And increasingly in England, not in other parts of the UK, we have a growing number of private colleges, which are often for profit. And this has been deliberately encouraged by the UK government, acting as the kind of English government in relation to higher education. I'll come back to those three stages of development later. But let me focus first of all on the formation of the polytechnics. This came about when a new government came into power in 1964, and the Minister of Education, Anthony Crossland, made a speech, a well-known speech in Woolwich, when he articulated the idea of the polytechnics for the first time as an alternative to universities. And that was enshrined in a white paper, a government policy document, a year later in 1966. The polytechnics themselves were formed by mergers of colleges of technology, colleges of art and design. Very reluctantly, most colleges of art and design were very averse to being brought into these larger combinations because they felt it would swamp their identity. And still in the UK, we have faculties of art and design in universities, but also independent art colleges. The main example of which is, of course, the Royal College of Art, but two specialist arts institutions as well, universities as well. And then during the course of the 1970s, colleges of education, teacher training colleges, were also brought into the polytechnics. This came about largely because the colleges of education were seen as non-viable. They were too small and there were too many of them. So a rather ruthless process of amalgamation and mergers began. A very small number were merged into traditional universities, but the great majority of them became parts of polytechnics. Initially, there were 29 polytechnics in England and one in Wales. Scotland never had polytechnics. It had institutions that looked very like polytechnics, which were called central institutions, because they were funded centrally by what was then the Scottish Education Department. At that point, the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government had not yet been re-established. So that's what happened in the mid-1960s when the polytechnics were formed. I think it's important to recognise they just didn't come out of the blue. There'd always been a binary system, in the sense there were a variety of types of institution. Back in the 1820s, so-called mechanics institutes were formed, and the successors of those, some of them became universities. Birkbeck College in the University of London, for example, was perhaps the preeminent example of that. Many of them, of course, became parts of technical colleges and then colleges of technology. So they evolved in different ways and to some degree random ways. I mentioned colleges of education, teacher training colleges. Of course, with the establishment of compulsory elementary education in the 1870s, there was a need to train the new teachers for these elementary schools, and many colleges were founded, many initially by churches, but also by local authorities, by local government as well. And then from the 1880s onwards, there were technical colleges established, which focused more on technical and vocational education. So there was always a kind of very diverse system, but it wasn't recognized as a system. And alongside that, you had universities, which also emerged to some degree in a relatively random fashion. It's also important to recognize that this was the second attempt by the government to create a kind of alternative to the traditional university. Excuse me. In 1956, a decade earlier, colleges of advanced technology had been established, and they were directly funded by the government, but were not given the status of universities. And that quickly changed in 1963, when, following the publication of the Robbins report, the colleges of advanced technology became more conventional universities. And some of the former colleges of advanced technology have become really very distinguished universities. The Bath is a good example. Strathclyde in Scotland is another. Now, the Polytechnics were like the College of Advanced Technology in the sense that they brought together advanced courses to produce stronger institutions by, as I said, merging colleges of technology, art, and later education. But they were different from the College of Advanced Technology in the sense that the Polytechnics remained under local government control until 1987, i.e. they were not autonomous like universities, and I'll explain the particular meaning of autonomous in the context of these policies. And they were unlike the College of Advanced Technology in a different sense. There was a much greater overlap with the traditional university's subject range. They didn't just focus on engineering and technology. For a long time, the second largest philosophy department in a UK higher education institution could be found in a polytechnic, not in a university. I think there were 5 separate dimensions of the binary system. There was the one that we tend to focus on, that they were at least supposedly more vocational or professional in their orientation, very much like the Polytechnics, the University of Applied Science, which we've heard about in Finland. A second dimension, I think, was that there were more flexible course structures. At that point, universities had relatively rigid course structures and catered almost exclusively for full-time young adults as their students. The Polytechnics were intended to be more flexible, I think. They pioneered the development of modules as opposed to the academic year as the kind of core academic currency. They had many more part-time students, and they were more open to awarding credit for other qualifications and previous study. A third dimension, less talked about today, but very, very prominent in the first decade of the Polytechnics, was that these were radical institutions. They were called sometimes people's universities. They were meant to be combating the elitism of the traditional universities. And of course, that was very much in tune with the times. The fourth one, and the one I want to emphasize, because this is the one that Anthony Crosland, the minister who introduced the policy, emphasized himself very strongly, was that they were seen as a public sector of higher education as opposed to an autonomous sector of higher education. The universities were seen as autonomous, not subject to the detailed direction of the state, while the polytechnics were intended to be part of the public sector and therefore very much part of the state, the local state as well as the national state. In fact, the local state more initially. And the final dimension of the binary system was that they were intended to be more local, or at least regional, more community-based institutions. Universities in practice had been very locally and regionally based until 1960, 1962, and many remain so to this day. But in 1962, a new policy was introduced by which all students were entitled to a grant for their living expenses when they went to university. So in a sense, they could be mobile anywhere within the UK. It made no difference. There was no advantage in attending a local institution. And as many of them were young and studying full-time, many of them were highly mobile. Now I think things have changed a bit. A second important point about the Polytechnics was that they were degree awarding right up to PhDs in practice from the start through a body I won't bother you with called the Council for National Academic Awards. It was a bureaucratic device which effectively allowed the Polytechnics to award their own degrees. And from the mid-1980s, they were given direct degree awarding powers up to and including doctoral programs. And a third important point was that there was extremely rapid student growth in the polytechnics, and many of it took place in fields that overlap to an increasing extent with universities: social sciences, business and management, IT, computing, health. And this was particularly intensified after 1981, when the incoming Margaret Thatcher government cut university budgets very fiercely and restricted the number of places available in universities. The result, of course, was that many of students who otherwise might have attended universities if normal growth conditions had continued, instead were effectively displaced into the polytechnics. Excuse me. The end game, as I call it, which really took place during the 1980s. First of all, within the polytechnics, there was a growth of national level governance and funding. Initially, this was a partnership between national government and local government, and a rather odd and anomalous body called the National Advisory Body was established. But then it became centralized when polytechnics were removed from the control of local authorities and local government, and a new body was called the Polytechnic Colleges and Funding Council. So what you effectively had from 1987 to 1992 were two parallel national systems of higher education. And not surprisingly, increasing concerns were expressed about duplication, the lack of coordination. But that was just the administrative context, the political context. There also took place during the 1980s a high degree of convergence between the polytechnics and the universities. In scale, both became large multi-faculty institutions. Subject mix, as I said, with a few exceptions. Medicine is the most obvious, but not law. Most subjects could be studied in both. And finally, in terms of their organizational structures and cultures, increasingly, these were large institutions which needed to be governed and managed in rather similar ways. So in 1992, a unified system was created, or rather, unified systems. Of course, an informal distinction was maintained between what were rather curiously called, and still to this day are curiously called, pre-1992 and post-1992 universities, In other words, the traditional universities existed in 1992 and the polytechnics that became universities after that date. This is a curious language which is still used, although I sometimes point out to people that students now entering these institutions had not been born when this distinction was effectively abandoned. But it's been perpetuated to some extent in terms of university so-called mission groups. These are effectively clubs of vice-chancellors, the most prominent of which is the Russell Group, which includes Oxford, Cambridge, the major research-intensive universities, but also includes Million Plus, which is the mission group that represents most of the former polytechnics. So it was a unified system, but there were still important distinctions being maintained. Then, of course, there were separate Scottish and Welsh higher education systems created, or rather strengthened at that point. Particularly in the case of Scotland, the system became really quite different in ethos, funding, governance, and many other dimensions from the English system. In practice, the only common features that remain are research funding, which tends to be predominantly a UK responsibility. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, now, although 80% of students are enrolled in universities, there are still other institutions. Some colleges, mainly further education colleges, but more recently what are now termed alternative providers, private for-profit institutions in England. So that's what happened in 1992. Was it a success or a failure, the binary system? Well, I think you can argue it both ways. You can certainly say it was a success in the sense that the polytechnics have not disappeared. They still exist as post-1992 universities. They, in fact, are large, perhaps even the majority component of the university sector. The fact that the mission group that represents most of the former polytechnics is called Million Plus, in other words, it has more than 1 million students enrolled as institutions, gives you some idea of the weight attached to the former polytechnics within the university sector. And of course, their status was enhanced. They were able to do things, recruit staff, recruit students, have an international presence as universities, which would have been more difficult if they continued to be polytechnics. But equally important, I think, is that the pre-1992 universities, the traditional universities, the ones that existed in 1992, became more polytechnic-like. They've become more polytechnic-like. They have adopted modular degrees with much more choice for students, much more flexible delivery, and focused more on professional education. Business schools are a major growth point across all universities in the UK. So I think there's a degree of convergence there, which accelerated after 1992, although it existed in the 1980s. But of course, you can argue it's failed. There has been an erosion of localism. We now effectively have a national system of higher education, or rather 4 national systems in the UK. And I think there has been a loss of local ownership. For example, the Mayor of London has responsibility for the underground, buses, public transport, a lot of housing, but has no involvement at all in higher education or further education in a formal sense. So there's been a loss of local ownership, and I think that's a weakness. And then I think the tension I mentioned earlier as a general point between pluralism according to function, a differentiation of missions, has been undermined by a hierarchy which is largely based on status. Politicians in the UK like to talk about our best universities, which of course implies that there are the rest, although they don't emphasize that quite as much. And just at the moment, I mean, we, as many of you know, have a phobia about immigration, which of course should be called people seeking a refuge. And the government is determined to reduce the number of people who come into the UK from other countries. They've identified the fact that international students make up a large proportion of people who come from outside the UK, and although they don't want to stop international students attending Oxford or Cambridge or possibly UCL, they now talk about perhaps preventing universities that have less good outcomes, as to put in a rather oblique way, being able to recruit international students to the same degree. And then finally, there's the old argument about academic drift. And I think this is quite complicated. Often we focus too much on research and say the former Politécnicos, the post-1992 universities, have become much more heavily engaged in research. And this has diverted from their true mission in terms of education. I think that's misleading. Because even when they were polytechnics, research, high quality research, was quite widely distributed across all types of institution. Of course, there were concentrations in the major institutions like Oxford and Cambridge and UCL and Manchester and so on, but they were unable to, I think, sorry, I've just been distracted by a message that's come up, but still, I can't read it at the moment. But the main change was research itself has become a much more differentiated and pluralist activity. In another context, I've, with colleagues, developed the idea of Mode 2 research. Research has become a very, very broad church. We're not just talking about traditional forms of scientific research based in laboratories anymore. Research takes place in lots of contexts, so one would expect it to actually have spread across the higher education system. A more important aspect, I think, of academic drift is what I call professional identities. And here, most institutions, most academics have very similar backgrounds, regardless of the kind of institution they are employed by. And to some degree, the institution they attend, they're employed by, whether it's a pre-92 or a post-92 university, is largely the result of when they became on the labour market, when they were looking for a job. So increasingly professional identities have become merged, and I think that's more important, and I would emphasise that more strongly than research. So finally, to draw things to a conclusion, these, as I say, are very, very preliminary and tentative conclusions. But clearly, above all this, there is a tension, or perhaps put in more positive terms, a dynamic between history, individual histories, whether of institutions or of countries, and the particular circumstances which form those, and the customs and traditions which remain important, on the one hand. On the other hand, the common dynamics of massification, and also I would call the diversification of research missions, which I was talking about a moment ago, which are common to all higher education systems everywhere in the world. And how that plays out is sometimes produces extremely complex and interesting scenarios. And to some extent, it impacts on the choice between dual or binary systems and more unified systems. A second tension or dynamic, if you like, is between what I call segmentation into separate sectors and institutional differentiation. Not, of course, an absolute choice. You can have both, but are contrasting approaches, I think, to trying to produce greater pluralism within higher education. It can be argued, I think, that segmenting a higher education system into separate sectors, universities and polytechnics, as in England, is rather rigid. It produces hierarchies. Perhaps it's rather old-fashioned, rather 20th century, because it's not very adaptable. Institutional differentiation, on the other hand, has the potential to be much more flexible, much more adaptable. Things can change much more quickly, and therefore perhaps it's more 21st century. The third point, conclusion I'd like to emphasize, and it's something I've said several times before, is that all institutions have become much more internally differentiated. When I attended the University of Oxford, it certainly didn't have a business school. It certainly has a business school now, and a very important and prominent one and well-funded one. So all institutions have become, of course, much larger and much more complex, and that change of scale and scope itself has produced fundamental differentiation. Then against the background of really quite radical forms of socio and economic change, I'm thinking in terms of changing status of women and other minorities and so on, which have had a major impact on the feel of UK higher education. And then finally, of course, disciplinary dynamism itself, the advance of science and how we conceive of knowledge. All these things have made institutions, whatever their titles, become much more internally differentiated. But you can never get away from the fact that systems exist, and to some extent they're regulated and organized. But they're also always developing, endlessly diversifying. There are new types of institution. As I said, the UK, the university is the dominant institutional type, and 80% of students are actually enrolled in universities. But there is still an endless peripheral of new kinds of institutions developing, some of which have university titles and some of which don't. Then there's an endless progression of new modes of delivery. I'm speaking to you online, but I think we're all aware of the impact of information and communication technologies on higher education itself, on teaching in higher education. We are, in a sense, living in a new information culture. And new forms of credential. We've moved away from traditional forms, bachelor's, master's, doctoral degrees. We now live in an age of mini credentials, many of which are provided in contexts which are not at all academic, according to our conventional understanding. So all these forms of dynamism are continuing to take place and possibly to accelerate. And I think they have a major impact on the choice between binary or dual systems and unified systems, because unified systems, of course, could never be truly unified. They themselves are dynamic and differentiating all the time. So my final word, what is my verdict? Whether Polytechnics a success or a failure? Well, I think they were a success in the sense they embedded a wider view of what a university can be into UK higher education. It enlarged the idea of a university away from a comparatively narrow, academically focused vision. But they were a failure in the sense that to maintain a separate sector of higher education with institutions with different titles, I think was bound to fail, and in a sense deserved to fail, because to continue that system is inevitably going to continue notions of hierarchy, which I think within a dynamic system of higher education we can no longer afford. Thank you for listening. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much. So we have 10 minutes now, for 5 to 10 minutes for maybe 1 or 2 questions, so I'll open the floor to those questions. Uma ou duas questões, se tivermos.
Hello, Peter. I don't know if you can see me. It's Ron Barnett here. It's nice to see you across the digital ether. Peter, I just want to pick up an issue which I was raising earlier about the role of the state, and to do it in this way and ask you a very simple question. Why do you think the transformation to a unified system came about why was it the polytechnics were entitled to call themselves universities? And I'll offer you two answers. One, in a way, you've described very nicely the way in which the polytechnics themselves have developed and become almost indistinguishable from universities. And so the time was ripe, you might say. But here's another option, and I'll put it to you and see what you think of it, that the polytechnics were allowed to call themselves universities, not so much to recognise the change in polytechnics, but to encourage the universities to become more like polytechnics.
Well, the short answer is that I think there's a lot of truth in that. And the original distinction that was made in the 1960s between, excuse me, polytechnics as a public sector of higher education and universities as an autonomous sector of higher education no longer applied. Universities ceased to be autonomous to a large degree. And that was a process that began in the 1990s and 1980s during the Thatcher government and continues to this day. So it was a distinction that no longer seemed valid. Now, whether it was deliberately meant to curb the autonomy of the universities, I'm not sure. It seemed to me inevitable that the autonomy of the traditional university, always a rather Arcadian utopian idea, I'm never sure realized in practice, depended on them being small, not consuming much in the way of public resources, and attached to a hierarchical and elitist society. When those conditions ceased to apply, universities inevitably became different kinds of animal. I heard your earlier question, Ron, about the universities being universal and the state being particular. Well, I'm not sure the historical record bears you out. There aren't many universities that have been universal. All have been national or, in the Middle Ages, established by popes, institutions which were seen as serving national needs, training priests, who of course were the bureaucrats, the civil servants of the day, training lawyers, people who served the state. Now we can have different conceptions of the state, but this kind of setting the state in opposition to universal values, I find slightly strange, particularly in a Western Enlightenment tradition where the state itself was the embodiment of an Enlightenment ideal, the enlightened state.
So we have time for one more question. Mais alguém? So maybe I'll ask a final question, if you don't mind. So I was just wondering to what extent you think that the failures that you pointed out about the experience have to do with the role of funding and the role of the market as a funding mechanism, and in particular, like the lack of a very clear sort of state-sponsored, like central financing line, if you want. So to what extent that that those funding mechanisms create sort of strong incentives for the types of failures that you identified. And just to make a final note, I think this is relevant from the point of view of the Portuguese system, which is, we could argue, clearly underfunded at this stage. So I'm just wondering about the role of funding in creating those failures that you pointed out.
Well, that's certainly a very lively debate in the UK. The UK government, operating as an English government in this respect in relation to universities and higher education, has deliberately tried to create a market system. It has largely failed to do so. There was always a market in higher education. In a sense, there was a market for prestige, to employ professors, to recruit the best students, and so on. But the idea to create a kind of functioning market in a more commercial sense has largely failed. Students pay high fees, and graduates are burdened with high levels of debt. But in practice, the state, through a kind of quasi-bank, provides all students with the money to pay their fees in the first place. So higher education remains free at the point of entry, even in England. In Scotland, of course, it's entirely free. if you come from Scotland, not if you come from another part of the UK, sadly. So I think that it's a very complex relationship. I'm not sure. I think it's another debate about the market, really. And I would make distinction between a functioning market in a commercial sense, and I see no real prospect of any higher education system in the world ever becoming a functioning market in that sense. And if we're honest, there aren't many real functioning markets anywhere, even in the commercial sphere. Look at energy, for example. I'd make a distinction between that and what I call marketized behavior. The deliberate encouragement of institutions to compete more strongly with each other, not necessarily to produce commercial-like market outcomes, but in a sense to raise standards, as is often seen by some UK politicians more towards the right than the left, who believe that competition raises standards. The great loss, as you identify, of course, is that the state no longer has such a strong role in steering the system. In England, deliberately, we have a body now which regulates universities as if they were energy companies or other law firms or whatever other bodies there might be. It no longer takes responsibility for trying to determine the overall shape of the English higher education system, which has, as a result, become rather chaotic and rather dysfunctional in many respects. In Scotland, it's a different system where the state still plays a very strong steering and direct funding role in higher education.
Thank you very much. So thanks very much for your talk. E agora fazemos uma interrupção. Eu vou passar a organização do próximo debate ao professor António Magalhães e teremos agora representantes do CRUP, do CSISP e da APESP. Obrigado.